Welcome back, deep divers. Ready for another plunge into the world of history's most intriguing and sometimes, let's be honest, kind of spooky books.
Spooky is putting it mildly, but that's what we're here for, right? To separate the spooky whispers from the actual content.
Exactly. And this time we're taking a deep dive into a book called Thaumaturgia, the science of miracles, magic, and superstition.
Now, that title alone is a mouthful.
Yeah, Thaumaturgia sounds like something straight out of a Harry Potter spellbook, but it actually reflects how people in the past tried to make sense of things that seemed totally out there.
It's like, how did they explain events that we might chalk up to coincidence, natural causes, or maybe even a bit of trickery?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we're going to be using a text simply titled thaumaturgia.pdf to explore all this. Think of it like we're time-traveling detectives figuring out how our ancestors viewed the world. Demons, magic, the whole 9 yards.
And trust me, some of these ideas are wilder than you might think.
All right, deep divers, buckle up because we're going deep. Let's start with someone who always seems to pop up in these discussions. The devil. Now, the book opens with a kind of surprising take on him.
Oh, yeah. So you know all those classic images of the devil horns, hooves, the works?
Oh yeah, like the ultimate Halloween costume?
Well, the author suggests those scary depictions were more for show than anything else. Like, they were scarier than what people actually believed about him.
So it's like the devil's PR team went a little overboard.
Maybe. But the text goes on to mention how the devil apparently preferred folks who, and I'm quoting here, belied the human form divine.
Okay, so what does that even mean?
Well, it gets a bit uncomfortable here, but the author connects this idea to how old women, especially, were often depicted in Italian poetry. Like, there is this association between them, sibyls, and ugliness, and they were somehow linked to the devil.
So basically, anyone who didn't fit this ideal image of beauty, especially as they aged, was somehow closer to evil.
Pretty much. It's a bit messed up when you think about it. It shows how societal anxieties about aging and being different got all tangled up with ideas about evil.
And it's not like the devil stopped there. The author claims he got way better at his job, saying he'd very much improved in his management of worldly affairs.
Yeah, like he went from harassing witches in the woods to, well, setting his sights a bit higher.
Upgrading his targets, so to speak.
Exactly. The author argues he started messing with the wisest men as well as greatest fools of the day. It's like he got smarter, sneakier in his approach.
Okay, so less about brute force, more about subtle manipulation.
Right, and to illustrate this, the text throws in some pretty vivid demonological stanzas.
Demonological stanzas.
Yes, think poetry, but about demons. These verses describe how the devil used to focus on the ugly and old, like your classic hags and sorcerers. But as his kingdom increases in growth, he shifts gears, trafficking with beauty and youth.
So instead of going for the obvious villains, he's blending in with the cool kids.
Exactly. He's disguising himself, infiltrating everything, the church, the court, even the city. It's a powerful image of how evil can be seductive and corrupt even those who seem untouchable.
It's a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, right?
Right.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about how people in the past explained the unexplained. Where did this whole belief in the supernatural begin?
Well, the text dives into this idea of a first cause, like what started everything.
Yeah, the ultimate origin story.
Yeah, but it suggests this was a hard concept for people to grasp back then. It was all too grand, too refined for them. They were more drawn to the tangible, to what they could actually see and touch.
Makes sense.
So when they encountered things they couldn't explain, they attributed it to these invisible beings that they believed lived everywhere.
Like they personified the forces of nature, right?
Exactly. They worshipped things they loved or feared away to either ensure good luck or keep danger at bay.
It's like if you can't understand it, give it a name,
Yeah.
a face, and try to appease it.
Right. And that's where polytheism comes in. All these local gods and spirits, they were a way to make sense of the chaos.
So every storm, every good harvest had a divine puppet master.
Pretty much. And then there's divination, the attempt to figure out the future or the will of these invisible beings.
Like reading tea leaves or something.
Kind of, but it was a huge deal back then, so much so that societies actually made laws against those who claimed to communicate with the devil.
Wait, so they were trying to regulate magic?
Exactly, but the text suggests these laws might have actually backfired.
How so?
Well, by criminalizing these practices, they made people even more fearful. They started seeing the devil's hand everywhere, blaming misfortune on witches and wizards.
It's like they created more witches by trying to stamp them out.
Exactly. But there's a glimmer of hope here. The text suggests that as philosophy progressed, belief in witchcraft started to decline. As people found rational explanations for things, they didn't need supernatural scapegoats anymore.
Makes sense. Okay, let's talk about magic itself. The text divides it into two main types, Thaumaturgia and Goetia. What's the difference?
So Thaumaturgia was seen as the good kind of magic. The wisest of the pagan world practiced it. They believed in calling upon good spirits to achieve spiritual enlightenment.
And Goetia?
Goetia was the opposite. It was all about summoning evil spirits, and it was generally frowned upon even by pagans.
So, like, one's angelic magic and the other's demonic.
Pretty much. Thaumaturgia was all about purifying the soul, connecting with the divine.
So what did they actually do? Like, what did a theurgist's day look like?
Well, they had a pretty strict lifestyle. Abstinence, no animal food, avoiding anything to do with death. It was all about achieving this state of intuition, which they believed gave them divine power.
Sounded intense.
And their rituals were super specific. The text says any mistake could render the whole thing useless.
High-stakes magic. But didn't that give them a built-in excuse if things didn't work out?
Sure. But the text suggests their deep study of universal nature might have given them insights into the physical world that allowed them to do things that seemed magical to others.
So maybe they weren't all just fakers.
Exactly. Big names like Hermes Trismegistus and Zoroaster were associated with Thaumaturgia.
Wow, some serious historical cred. But Goetia, the bad boy of magic, what do we know about that?
The text doesn't go into much detail, probably because it was so despised.
Makes sense. Okay, let's move on to divination. The text mentions a bunch of different methods people use to try and see the future.
Oh yeah, starting with the Chaldean Magi. They were all about astrology.
So like reading horoscopes.
Kind of, but way more complex. They used everything, animals, metals, plants, all links to the stars.
Whole cosmic system.
Right. Timing was crucial. And their rituals were pretty dramatic, jumping, shouting, sacrifices, the whole shebang.
Sounds like a rave with some extra steps.
Within the Magi, there were different specialists, charmers, magicians, and astrologers. They even had oneirocritici, which were basically dream interpreters.
So they took their dreams seriously. What about the Jewish Magi?
Well, after they returned from exile in Babylon, they lost the gift of prophecy, according to the text. So they started turning to sorcery and divination.
Fill in the void, yeah.
Yeah. The Talmud even has instructions for superstitious rites, which is interesting. After the destruction of Jerusalem, these Jewish magicians became pretty well known, often using dream interpretation as a cover for their activities.
So maybe not all of them were legit.
Right. But what's interesting is that, like the Chaldeans, they also relied heavily on astrology. Shows how these ideas traveled across cultures.
Okay, let's move on to oracles. The text mentions some pretty famous ones.
Oh yeah, oracles were a big deal. They were believed to be direct channels to the divine. Like the Pythoness at Delphi, who'd inhale these prophetic vapors and then speak in verses.
That sounds kind of trippy.
There's even a story about a Pythoness getting so overcome by the fumes that she died right after giving a prophecy.
Yikes. And then there's the Oracle of Trophonius.
Yeah, that one had a super elaborate ritual, and anyone who consulted it was said to never laugh again.
So no stand-up comedy for them.
Not really. The text suggests these guys who built Apollo's temple, the Agamedes and Trophonius, might have actually been thieves who met a bad end, and the whole oracle thing was built up around it.
So a mix of genuine belief and maybe some embellishment. Did oracles disappear after Christianity came along?
Not necessarily. There's a guy, Van Dale, who argued they were still around even during the reign of Theodosius the Great. He mentions laws being passed against those who consulted them.
So old habits die hard. But the text seems a bit skeptical about how legit oracles really were.
Yeah, the author says both pagans and Christians agreed that many were fakes. Ventriloquism is even mentioned as a possible explanation for those disembodied voices.
Sneaky. But the text also suggests that some oracles might have genuinely believed they were channeling the divine, right?
Right. They'd use drugs or vapors to induce trances and then interpret their visions as messages from the gods.
So a bit of pharmacology, a bit of theatrics, and a whole lot of belief. The text also mentions using lots for divination. What's that all about?
Sword tests, basically drawing random things like letters or tickets or rolling dice to seek guidance.
Like a magic 8-ball.
Kind of. They had different types, like the Sortes Prenestinae, Sortes Homericae, even Sortes Virgilianae. And early Christians even used this method, opening the Bible randomly for guidance.
Wow, so even the Bible could be used for divination. What about animal sacrifice?
Oh, yeah, that was huge, especially in Roman tradition. They'd examine the animal's guts, the liver, heart, spleen, all of it.
Not for the squeamish.
Definitely not. They'd look for anything unusual, blemishes, the wrong size, position all signs of good or bad fortune.
Reading the future and entrails. Okay, let's talk about prodigies, those strange events that freak people out.
The Roman historians are full of them. Two suns in the sky, weird lights, showers of milk or blood, deformed creatures, you name it.
Sounds like a bad acid trip.
And people saw these as omens, signs of impending doom.
But the text tries to explain some of these rationally, right?
Yeah, like the two suns could be a reflection, the lights could be the aurora borealis, showers of stones might be volcanic eruptions, even the milk and blood could be weird weather stuff.
Okay, so maybe not so supernatural after all.
The text also suggests that the whole belief in fairies might have come from the East.
Fairies.
Yeah, like little winged creatures. The idea is that travelers brought back stories from the Crusades, and those tales took root in Europe.
So, like, imported folklore. What about those fire festivals?
Oh yeah, Beltane in Ireland is a good example. It's connected to Druidic traditions where they'd light these huge bonfires for protection and drive cattle through them.
Through the flame?
Yep. November also had big fire feasts, and people would extinguish their home fires and then relight them from the communal bonfire, like a symbol of renewal.
Interesting. And it wasn't just fire, right? Certain places, like fountains and stones, were also considered special.
Totally. Some fountains, like the Castalian fountain in Greece, were believed to have prophetic powers. People would even use mirrors in sacred wells to try and predict if someone would recover from an illness.
Like a magical selfie?
Right, kinda. The Druids were big on stones, especially the Logan stone, which was said to move miraculously. They'd use it in rituals to confirm authority or give judgments.
So like a divine gavel.
Exactly. And then there were these herbs, Solago and Samotis, that the Druids had these super specific rituals for gathering.
What about those serpent's eggs?
Oh yeah, supposedly formed from the saliva of a bunch of snakes under a certain moon phase. They thought it brought victory, but the text calls it out as one of many ridiculous fooleries imposed on people.
Okay, let's move on to ancient medicine. Let's talk about Aesculapius, the Greek god of healing.
His imagery is super interesting. The text traces it back to Egyptian gods like Anubis and Thout. That whole staff with the snake, apparently, evolved from a symbol showing the Nile's flood levels.
From flood gauge to medical symbol, that's a glow-up. And the Greeks and Romans added their own spin on him, right?
Yeah, they gave him a family, sons who were famous surgeons, daughters who represented health and healing. The knots in his staff were even said to represent the complexities of the medical profession.
So like a divine medical dynasty. And the Romans had all those minor gods for every little thing.
Oh yeah, they had gods for everything. Birth, childhood, marriage, travel, even accounting. It's wild. It shows how they saw supernatural forces working in every aspect of their lives.
A very busy pantheon.
But when it came to health, the text warns against relying on Babylonian astrology.
Why is that?
They distinguished between natural astrology, like meteorology and weather, and judicial astrology, which was about predicting individual fortunes and health based on the stars. They weren't fans of that.
So no trusting horoscopes for medical advice.
Right. What about alchemy?
Ah, yes. The quest to turn lead into gold.
And to find a universal cure. But the text is pretty dismissive of it, calling it a ridiculous analogy to equate the value of gold with medicinal properties.
So the get-rich-quick scheme of the ancient world.
Pretty much. They were obsessed with making potable gold, basically drinkable gold, but it never worked.
But the belief in planetary influence was pretty widespread, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, the idea that planets controlled nations and individuals. Astrologers claimed they could read the stars to tell you everything about your life, your personality, your future, your health, even when you die.
Talk about a cosmic resume.
And there's this story about a guy named Walter and his overprotective dad who believed in all this astrology stuff.
What happened?
So this astrologer predicts Walter will die before he's 20 unless he's kept totally isolated. His dad freaks out and builds him a tower to keep him safe.
Tower? Like Rapunzel.
Haha. Kinda. But the story ends on a cliffhanger, leaving us wondering if the prediction came true. It shows how these beliefs could really mess with people's heads.
Okay, let's talk about amulets and talismans.
People believed these little trinkets, especially metal ones with planetary symbols, could bring good luck and protect you from harm. Even soldiers wore them, hoping for invincibility in battle.
Like a magical bulletproof fist.
Exactly. But not everyone bought into it. There's this funny story about the astrologer Lilly, who couldn't even figure out who left some rotten meat at his door.
So much for his supernatural power.
This persisted. Lilly even claimed he could diagnose diseases using it.
Okay, what are some of the more out there remedies people tried?
Well, they thought writing abracadabra in a specific way could cure fever. And there was this herb, lunaria, you had to pick under the moonlight for it to work. Even Lord Verulam, a pretty scientific guy, admitted that the power of belief could influence healing. He told a story about curing his own warts using just bacon rind.
Bacon cures everything.
Yeah.
So what's the deal with amulets versus talismans?
They basically served the same purpose, protection and good luck. But Egyptian amulets were usually found with mummies, while Babylonian talismans were thought to be older.
And the Samothracian talismans?
Those were iron rings believed to ward off evil. In general, talismans were either astronomical, with celestial symbols, magical, with strange figures and names, or a mix of both.
Like a cosmic charm bracelet. Were there any biblical talismans?
Some rabbis thought Moses' brazen serpent was a kind of talisman, and Apollonius of Tyana's miracles were sometimes attributed to talismans.
Interesting. What about those Maltese stones?
People in Malta thought these stones, shaped like serpent eyes and tongues, could protect against poison and disease. They connected it to St. Paul's shipwreck on the island.
A biblical souvenir.
But the text says these were probably just fossilized shark teeth.
So another case of mistaking natural stuff for the supernatural. The text also mentions chicken eggs with markings that look like snakes and comets.
Yeah, and Indian nuts that resembled ape faces. These natural quirks might have been seen as omens back then.
It's amazing how the mind finds meaning in everything. Okay, let's talk about music. Apparently, it wasn't just for entertainment back then.
Nope. The ancients believed it had power over the mind, could influence animals, and even cure diseases. Marcianus Capella said certain songs could cure fevers, and Asclepius supposedly used trumpet blasts to heal deafness.
Hold on, trumpet blast to cure deafness.
Yeah, sounds a bit counterintuitive, right? But there are accounts from the French Academy of Sciences describing how music helped people recover from illnesses that regular medicine couldn't touch.
So, like musical therapy.
Kind of. They had a theory about the link between the ear and the nervous system and how musical vibrations could have a healing effect. And there's this story about a musician with a terrible fever who felt better when he heard a concert.
The power of music. Okay, let's talk about those omens and premonitions. We've already covered prodigies, but what about comets?
Comets were seen as super bad news, a sign that disaster was coming. Mr. Bale even called it a leftover bit of paganism that stuck around even after Christianity became the norm.
So, space anxiety is nothing new.
And it all boils down to the human desire to know the future and our fascination with the marvelous.
We love a good mystery.
And sometimes leaders would exploit those desires for their own gain. Like Alexander the Great, he'd manipulate omens to boost his army's morale. He even had a soothsayer fake a prophecy of victory by writing it on a sacrificed animal's liver.
Sneaky. But wasn't Alexander a bit superstitious himself?
The text does say that.
So even the great conqueror had his irrational fears.
And we all love a good story, right? So it's no surprise that history is full of embellishments and fantastical elements. Even those stories about Charlemagne's nephew Roland, a lot of it was probably made up.
History needs a little spice. Okay, what about those mirages?
Mirages, those illusions of water or landscapes in the desert or icy regions, could easily be mistaken for magic.
Especially the Fata Morgana?
Oh yeah, that's a famous one, seen in the Strait of Messina. It projects images of the opposite shoreline onto the water, like a perfect reflection. People thought it was an enchanted place.
Makes sense. The text makes a good point about trying to find natural explanations for these seemingly magical events.
Exactly. It uses those showers of quicksilver blood and frogs as examples. These might have had natural causes we just didn't understand back then.
Okay, let's talk about universal remedies, the quest for a cure-all.
The text says that's basically a pipe dream, something gullible people fall for. It's super critical of those who push miracle cures, ignoring all the harm they cause. There's even a quote saying belief in quackery can be worse than war.
Wow, that's a strong statement. The text emphasizes how important it is to get a proper diagnosis instead of just grabbing any random remedy. Okay, let's talk about Obeah, what was called Negro witchcraft back then.
Obeah was a form of witchcraft practiced by enslaved Africans in the West Indies. The authorities were terrified of it and made strict laws against it. They thought it could cause harm through spells and psychological manipulation.
So like a weapon of the oppressed.
In a way, they'd use things like grave dirt, blood, coffin-shaped wood, pretty creepy stuff in their charms.
And it only worked if you believed in it.
That's what the text says. Interestingly, the word obi apparently comes from the Egyptian word for serpent, linking it to ancient serpent worship.
So even their magic had deep roots.
And obeah was also used to incite rebellions, so it was seen as a threat to the colonial powers.
Speaking of dark stuff, let's talk about secret poisoning.
In Rome, back in 1659, there were all these mysterious deaths of young women. Turns out there was a secret society of poisoners led by this woman named Spara.
A poison ring?
Yeah, and Spara had learned from a woman named Tofania in Palermo who sold this poison disguised as manna of St. Nicholas of Bavay.
So like a holy hit woman.
Basically. And then there's the case of the Marquise de Brinvilliers in France.
What did she do?
Her lover, St. Croix, learned about poisons in prison, and after he died, they found a whole stash of the stuff. Turns out the Marchioness had been using it on people.
Yikes.
She confessed and was executed. The text also mentions an Omaha chief who used arsenic as medicine to control his people.
So poison wasn't just a European thing.
Nope. Okay, what about rings? They weren't just jewelry, right?
Tell me more.
Ancient magicians thought rings had mystical powers. They believed they could connect you to the secrets of nature and the cosmos.
Like a magical mood ring.
Something like that. The Spartans, though, they only wore iron rings, very on brand for them. And in Persia, the king would give out rings as a sign of favor. There's even a story about Apollonius of Tyana getting a ring from this wise guy, Iarchus, that supposedly gave him knowledge of all of nature's secrets.
Okay, what's the deal with lucky and unlucky days?
Lots of ancient cultures believed certain days were inherently good or bad, often based on historical events.
So, like Friday the 13th.
Exactly. They'd avoid doing anything important on unlucky days. February 24th was considered particularly bad, but the text points out how the same day could be lucky for one person and unlucky for another. It's all relative.
Okay, hit me with some more of those random superstitions.
Oh man, there are so many. Estonian shepherds would sprinkle each other with water for good luck with their cattle. People wouldn't name predators directly, afraid of attracting them. They'd use salt to ward off wolves, and howling wolves were a bad omen. Dropping something was supposed to make wolves let go of their prey. And they avoided talking about hares near fields or pests during meals.
Sounds like a lot of rules to remember.
Right. They'd even beat hens to make them lay more eggs. And sailors believed that a baby's call could protect them from drowning.
A baby's what?
It's the membrane that sometimes covers a baby's head at birth. They thought it was magical. Even finding beans growing the wrong way could freak people out.
So basically they saw omens everywhere.
Pretty much. Now, back to astrology. The text talks about how people linked specific planets to diseases.
Like Mars is the god of war, so he must also be the god of...
inflammation. Yeah, they had all sorts of wacky connections, and they had all these elaborate treatments based on planetary alignments. Like, you had to get your bloodletting done at just the right time, even if you weren't sick. They thought you should only gather herbs under a friendly planet, and there were specific days you weren't supposed to take any medicine at all. The author is amazed that even educated people believe this stuff.
Well, sometimes even smart people can fall for weird ideas. Yeah. Speaking of which, let's talk about Paracelsus and Van Helmont.
These guys were early chemists, but also alchemists. They were obsessed with transmuting metals and finding that universal cure.
Didn't really work out, did it?
Nope. Paracelsus was this flamboyant figure who boasted about his discoveries, but apparently he could barely read. There is even a story about him having a familiar spirit named Azot that lived in his sword hilt.
So like a magical sidekick.
Right. Van Helmont was more educated, but just as enthusiastic about these wacky ideas. He used all this crazy jargon and claimed he could cure fevers in 4 days.
Sounds like a lot of hype. The text compares these guys to mesmerists.
Mesmerism was all about animal magnetism and hypnosis. It was a big fad, but eventually a commission that included Benjamin Franklin debunked it, saying it was just the power of suggestion.
The placebo effect is a powerful thing.
Right. The text also mentions other fads like physiognomy and phrenology, basically judging people by their faces and skulls. And there was this revival of the ideas of Jacob Böhmen, who was this mystic.
So there's always a new fad popping up.
Exactly. And blood transfusion. That was another thing they tried for rejuvenation. It had some promising results initially, but then they had to abandon it because of complications and ethical concerns.
Yeah, injecting someone else's blood into you, that's bound to cause some problems. Okay, finally, let's talk about the Rosicrucians.
Ah, yes, the mysterious Rosicrucians. They were a secret society that emerged in the 17th century and borrowed a lot of ideas from Paracelsus.
So, alchemists with a flair for the dramatic.
They released a bunch of writings claiming they knew all these ancient secrets and that they were going to change the world.
World domination via alchemy.
Well, they also believed the world was ending soon, so they wanted to bring about a universal reformation. They thought the wicked would be punished, the Jews would convert, and Christianity would take over the world.
Ambitious goals.
And they said they could extend human life, which is ironic considering Paracelsus died pretty young.
So, what's the takeaway from all this?
Well, Thaumaturgia really highlights how people have always tried to understand and control the unknown. We see how beliefs, rituals, and natural events all get tangled up in their explanations. And it's fascinating to see how some ideas persisted through the ages, while others died out as science advanced.
It's a reminder that even those who seem rational can be influenced by these deep-seated beliefs and desires. It's a part of what makes us human, I guess.
So, deep divers, here's a question for you. How much do you think these old ways of thinking still influence us today?
Yeah, are we really that different from those folks who were reading omens and animal guts and wearing amulets for good luck?
It's something to think about.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into thaumaturgia. Thanks for joining us, and remember, keep an open mind.
And maybe avoid those serpent eggs.